Every Tuesday morning, a flatbed truck backs up to a neglected farm plot and dumps 3 tons of bruised, split, rotting apples onto the grass. The orchard workers laugh as they leave. The manager told his crew she won't last a month. Neighbors slow down to stare at the mountain of fruit that looks more like a landfill than a plan. But the young woman who asked for every one of those rejects isn't dumping them. She's about to turn them into something the same orchard will soon pay her real money to make. Her name is Emily Carter. She's 24, has no farming experience, and for 11 months she's taken every load of rotten apples the orchard dumps without asking for a single dollar. She isn't making compost. The question isn't what she's building out there behind the barn. It's why she sees gold in what an entire industry decided was worthless. The answer starts with a funeral, 11 acres of overgrown land, and one half-remembered sentence her grandmother told her when she was a child. 18 months before the first truckload arrived, Emily Carter was living in a one-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from downtown Rochester, working a marketing job she was good at and hated in roughly equal measure. She spent her days writing copy for products she didn't care about, and her evenings staring at a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Then her grandmother, Ruth Carter, passed away and left her the only thing she had of any real value: 11 acres of overgrown farmland outside Millbrook, a farmhouse with a leaning porch, a barn full of rusted equipment, and an orchard that hadn't been pruned in over a decade. Emily drove out for the funeral and stayed 3 extra days. Then she went back to Rochester, gave notice at her job, and moved into the farmhouse with 4 boxes of clothes and no plan beyond fixing the porch before winter set in. The property told its own story if you knew how to read it. Wild grass had swallowed the old rows of apple trees her grandmother once tended. The cider press in the barn had gone stiff with rust. Fence posts leaned at angles that suggested decades of frost heave and nobody caring enough to straighten them. It was, by any reasonable measure, a mess. 3 miles down the county road sat Haverson Orchards, one of the largest commercial apple growers in the region, moving tens of thousands of tons of fruit each season into supermarkets and juice plants across the Northeast. Not every apple that came off those trees was fit for market. Bruised drops, fruit stung by hail, apples that sat one day too long before picking and went soft at the shoulder. The orchard's disposal costs for unsellable fruit ran into real money every autumn, tipping fees, hauling, diesel for trucks that carried rejects to a composting facility 2 counties over. When the orchard's operations manager, a weathered man named Grant Ashby, heard through a mutual acquaintance that the Carter place had empty acreage and a young owner looking for any kind of income, he made her an offer that sounded almost too easy: free apples. All she had to do was let his trucks dump the rejects on her land instead of paying to haul them elsewhere. Emily said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Grant blinked at her enthusiasm. Most landowners expected money for the privilege or refused outright, unwilling to deal with mountains of rotting fruit attracting every yellow jacket in 3 townships. Emily wanted neither arrangement. She just wanted the apples. Word got around fast. Within a week, half of Millbrook had an opinion about the Carter girl and her rotten apples. Her uncle called to ask if she'd lost her mind. A former high school classmate posted a photo of the growing pile online with a caption that got more laughing emojis than she probably intended. Even Grant, driving past a month in, admitted to a coworker that he half expected her to call it quits by the second delivery. Emily kept showing up every Tuesday morning to meet the trucks anyway. To understand why Emily said yes so fast, you have to understand Ruth Carter. Ruth wasn't wealthy. She wasn't well known outside of Millbrook, where she was mostly remembered for the pies she brought to the church potluck, and the way she never let a bruised apple go in the compost pile if there was any flesh left worth saving. Ruth had a habit when Emily was young of picking through the ugly bin at the farmer's market, the apples too scarred or lopsided to sell at full price, and buying the whole lot for almost nothing. She'd spend the evening turning them into applesauce, pie filling, dried rings strung on twine over the wood stove. Emily used to ask her why she didn't just buy the nice apples like everyone else. Ruth's answer never changed. "The fruit doesn't know it's supposed to be worth less," she told her once, wiping her hands on her apron. "People decided that. Nature never did." It was a small thing to say, the kind of sentence a grandmother tosses off while peeling apples on a Tuesday evening. Emily didn't think about it again for over a decade. But standing in a marketing job she didn't love, staring at inherited land she didn't know what to do with, the memory came back with startling clarity the week Grant Ashby made his offer. She didn't have a business plan. She had a half-remembered sentence and 11 acres of empty grass. So she grabbed a notebook, ordered a few food-grade barrels online, and decided to teach herself how to turn rotten apples into something the world would pay for. Her first attempt would nearly drive her out of the barn for good. Emily's plan, once she let herself have one, was straightforward in theory. Turn the rejected apples into vinegar. Apple cider vinegar had real market value, a long shelf life, and most importantly, didn't require the fruit to look presentable. Rot, in a strange way, was almost an asset. Overripe apples carry more natural sugar, and sugar is exactly what fermentation needs to work with. But in practice, almost nothing about it came easily. Her first attempt was a disaster she still describes, half laughing, as the barn smell that wouldn't leave. She crushed a few 100 pounds of apples in the old cider press, hauled the pulp and juice into food-grade buckets, and waited for nature to do the rest. What she got instead was a thick gray film across the surface, and a smell so sharp it drove her out of the barn for 2 days. She'd skipped sanitizing her equipment properly. Wild mold had gotten there before the yeast did. Most people would have quit right there. Emily bought a bottle of sanitizer and started again. Batch 2 went further before it failed. She'd learned to clean everything, learned that wild yeast already living on apple skins would start fermentation on its own if she left the crushed fruit alone in a covered container. The juice fizzed, turned cloudy, and after about 2 weeks had converted much of its sugar into alcohol. It smelled for the first time like something intentional instead of accidental. Then it stalled. The alcohol just sat there for a month, refusing to turn into vinegar. Emily couldn't figure out what she'd done wrong until she read a fermentation guide that explained the one thing she'd missed. Acetic acid bacteria, the organisms that actually convert alcohol into vinegar, need oxygen to do their work. She had sealed the containers too tightly. She had suffocated them without realizing it. She started leaving the containers loosely covered with cloth instead of tight lids. The third batch finally turned, and then it exploded. Not literally, no shattered glass, no dramatic mess, but pressure built up in one jug she'd forgotten to loosen, and it blew its cap clean across the barn floor at 11 at night, startling her so badly she dropped the flashlight she was carrying. She stood there in the dark, heart pounding, staring at the foam spilling over the lip of the jug, and for the first time since she'd moved onto the property, she genuinely considered giving up. Not because it was hard, but because she was 3 batches in and still producing nothing but mistakes. Batch 4 turned to vinegar. Technically, it came out cloudy, sharp in the wrong ways, and inconsistent from jug to jug. She'd been mixing apples from different weeks together, different sugar levels, different degrees of rot, with no consistency in her ratios. The liquid in one jug tasted almost passable. The liquid in the jug right next to it tasted like it wanted to strip paint. She knew she was close, but close wasn't the same as done. A vinegar maker 2 counties over, a retired winemaker named Milo Sanquist, took pity on her after she posted a confused question in an online fermentation forum. He spent an hour on the phone with her, walking her through pH testing, the importance of tracking the mother, the living cellulose culture that forms during fermentation and can be reused to seed future batches, and the basic chemistry of what she was actually doing. He told her something that changed everything. The softest apples, the ones closest to rot, the ones the orchard was embarrassed to hand over, those were the ones with the highest sugar content, the ones that would make the best vinegar. Everything the orchard had treated as waste was actually the most valuable fruit she could ask for. Batch 5 was steadier but still thin, drinkable but nowhere near the balance she was chasing. By the 6th batch, something had shifted. Emily wasn't guessing anymore. She tested pH with strips instead of hopping for the best. She kept a log of which apple varieties fermented fastest. The tartar drops from the orchard's older trees, it turned out, made a sharper, more complex vinegar than the sweeter modern varieties grown on the newer rows. She learned to skim the mother carefully and keep a portion alive between batches instead of starting from nothing every time. She filtered the finished vinegar through layers of cheesecloth until it ran clear instead of muddy. That sixth batch, when she finally tasted it off a spoon in the barn on a cold October evening, made her sit down on an overturned bucket and just breathe for a minute. It was sharp, bright, faintly sweet at the edges. Nothing like the harsh, cloudy liquid from her earlier attempts. It tasted like something she could actually sell. She set the spoon down and stared at the row of barrels in front of her, the notebook full of failed attempts, the 11 acres outside still piled with rotting apples that nobody had believed in. She had done it. But now came the question she hadn't let herself ask until this moment. Would anyone else agree that it was worth paying for? Or had she just spent 11 months learning to make something the world would ignore the same way it ignored the apples she started with? Emily didn't try to sell her first proper batch. She gave it away. She poured small jars for neighbors, for her aunt, for a woman at the feed store who'd been kind to her during the early apple pile-mocking months. She didn't charge anyone. She wanted to know if the vinegar was actually good or if a year of frustration had made her biased. The feedback came back louder than she expected. Word moved through Millbrook the same way the jokes about her rotten apples once had, except this time it carried a different kind of curiosity. A local chef named Owen Pewitt, who ran a small farm-to-table restaurant 20 minutes away, tried a jar a friend had passed along. He called Emily directly, asking if she had more. She didn't, not yet, but the call pushed her to scale up. She bought a dozen food-grade barrels, negotiated a slightly larger and more consistent supply of rejects from Grant at the orchard, and began treating the operation less like an experiment and more like a business. She registered a name, Millbrook Reserve Vinegar. Then she worked through the licensing required to sell a food product commercially, which turned out to be its own small education full of inspections and paperwork she'd never anticipated. Owen Pewitt became her first paying customer, buying vinegar by the case for his restaurant's vinaigrettes and pickling program. He introduced her to a farm shop owner 2 towns over, who introduced her to a specialty grocer, who eventually put a handful of bottles on a shelf next to imported balsamic vinegar 3 times the price. Each new relationship solved a problem the last one had created. Owen's order was too small to justify a bigger barrel setup on its own, but the farm shop's order pushed her past the break-even point on her equipment. The grocer wanted consistent labeling and a shelf-stable product, which forced her to formalize her bottling and filtration process. A regional distributor found her at a small food festival and wanted volume she couldn't yet produce alone. And that was what finally convinced her to hire her first employee, a former orchard hand who already knew apples better than she did. 2 years after that first truckload arrived, Millbrook Reserve Vinegar had outgrown the barn. Emily converted an old equipment shed into a proper production space, added 6 new fermentation tanks, and brought on a second employee to handle bottling and shipping. She kept the labels plain on purpose. The orchard's name, the harvest year, a short line about where the apples came from, because she'd learned that customers cared as much about the story behind the bottle as they did about the taste inside it. The orchard, once a source of endless rejects, became something closer to a partner. Grant Ashby started setting aside specific varieties for her at her request instead of dumping a random mix. Haverson Orchard saved real money, no longer paying to haul fruit 2 counties away. What had started as a favor to a young woman with no plan had become a working relationship that benefited them both. By the 3rd year, Millbrook Reserve Vinegar was on shelves in health food stores across 3 states, sitting in the same specialty grocer that had taken her first small order and had crossed into 6 figures in annual revenue. A number Emily still has trouble saying out loud without laughing a little, remembering the neighbor who once asked, only half joking, what exactly she was burying behind that barn. The people who once slowed their trucks to stare at the rotting pile eventually became customers themselves. The neighbor who joked about buried bodies bought a case for his daughter's wedding favors. The former classmate who'd posted the mocking photo online now tags Millbrook Reserve vinegar in her own grocery hauls without a trace of irony. Emily never brings any of it up. When former skeptics walk through her door, she treats them exactly the way she treats every other customer, with a sample spoon and a straightforward answer to whatever question they ask. She doesn't need an apology. The shelf space says everything that needs saying. But the real payoff wasn't in the revenue or even the irony of her critics becoming clients. It was in a single moment she hadn't seen coming. One Tuesday morning, 3 years after the first load of apples had spilled onto her property, Grant Ashby's truck pulled up not to dump rejects, but to deliver something else entirely. An order, the first one the orchard had ever placed with her. Haverson Orchards wanted Millbrook Reserve vinegar to sell in their own farm market. The same man who had once laughed loudest now stood on her porch with a purchase order in his hand, admitting that he couldn't keep the chips on the shelf. And Emily realized, holding that order form on the same grass where she'd once stood clueless and uncertain, that the thing she'd built hadn't just changed her life. It had rewritten the rules for everyone who had ever called her crazy. Emily still meets the trucks every Tuesday. That part never changed. The gate is still open, the drivers still know the route by heart, and the orchard still sends what it can't sell. But everything else about those mornings is different now. Grant Ashby gets out of the cab now instead of just waving from the window. He walks around to inspect the load himself, not to check for quality, but to point out specific varieties he set aside at her request. The drivers, the same ones who used to shake their heads and smirk, now ask her questions about fermentation while they unload. The mountain of rotting fruit that once drew stares and laughter from the county road is gone. In its place are organized rows of food-grade barrels, a drying shed she built with reclaimed lumber, and a production space that hums with the quiet rhythm of a business that no longer needs to explain itself. The neighbor who once called the county extension office now stops by most Saturdays to buy a bottle and ketchup. The former classmate who posted the mocking photo. She recently asked if Millbrook Reserve Vinegar might sponsor a local charity event she was organizing. Emily said yes without hesitation, not because she needed the publicity, but because the irony of that particular request was too perfect to refuse. She never brings up the past. She doesn't need to. 3 years after that first truckload, the vinegar born from fruit nobody wanted has won a gold medal at a regional food competition and been written up in a culinary magazine that once featured only European balsamics. A distributor in California reached out last month. A restaurant group in Chicago wants her vinegar for all 12 of their locations. The numbers she once scribbled in a barn notebook, batch weights, pH readings, fermentation times, are now part of a production system that turns out thousands of bottles a year. But that's not the part of the story Emily thinks about most. What she thinks about is a spiral-bound journal she found while cleaning out the farmhouse attic. It belonged to Ruth. Inside, alongside pie recipes and church potluck notes, was a single page dated 1982. On it, Ruth had written a short list. Apples nobody wants dried, sauced, or vinegar. Underneath, in pencil so faint Emily almost missed it, she'd added one more line. Don't throw away what someone else might need. Emily had never seen that journal before. She'd remembered the sentence about the fruit not knowing its worth, but she'd had no idea her grandmother had tried something similar decades earlier and let the idea go. Ruth never had the money for barrels or the time to scale up. She just quietly lived by the principle and passed it down without ever expecting it to take root. Emily sat on the attic floor and cried for 10 minutes, then went downstairs and checked on her latest batch. That notebook now sits on a shelf in the production barn, next to the original Mother Culture from batch 6, still alive and still seeding every new barrel. Employees call it the grandmother starter. Emily calls it proof. What the story was never really about in the end was vinegar. It was about a way of looking at things that most people never bother to practice. Ruth Carter spent her life proving that value doesn't disappear just because something looks broken, bruised, or unwanted. It just becomes harder for most people to see. Emily spent a year of failed batches and one exploded jug learning that her grandmother had been right the entire time. The fruit didn't know it was supposed to be worth less. And as it turned out, neither did she. Here's the number that still makes Grant Ashby shake his head when he tells the story to new hires. Millbrook Reserve vinegar now generates more profit per ton of fruit than the orchard's fresh apple sales do on their best days. The same apples Haverson once paid to haul away for compost are now the raw material for a product that outturns the premium fruit. Grant doesn't laugh anymore. He keeps a bottle of Emily's vinegar on his office desk, next to a photo of the original apple pile that started everything. He tells anyone who asks that the best business deal he ever made was the one he didn't understand at the time. Somewhere in Millbrook right now, another truck is pulling up to another pile of something everyone else has already decided is worthless. Most people will drive past without a second look, same as they always have. But every once in a while, someone stops. Someone squints at the mess and sees something the rest of us missed. That's the thread running through this entire story, and it's bigger than apples or vinegar or even one stubborn 24-year-old who refused to listen when the whole town told her she was wasting her time. It's about the quiet, unglamorous truth that the best opportunities almost never announce themselves. They show up looking like problems, like piles of rotting fruit on a Tuesday morning, like inherited land nobody wanted. Like a half-remembered sentence from a grandmother who never got to see what it would grow into. Emily didn't have a business degree or a trust fund or a single person who believed in her plan when she started. She had 11 acres, a notebook, and a willingness to fail 6 times in a row before she got it right. That combination turned out to be enough, because what she was really building wasn't just a vinegar brand. It was a different way of seeing, the same way her grandmother saw when she bought the ugly apples at the farmer's market and turned them into something her family would remember for decades. Value doesn't disappear just because nobody else noticed it yet. It sits there, waiting, until someone comes along who's stubborn enough to look. If this story reminded you that opportunity doesn't always arrive looking like one, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments about something you once overlooked that turned out to matter. Share this with someone who needs a reminder today that the messiest looking chances are sometimes the best ones. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight.